Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
In the last few videos, we've been talking about the primary control, and you've had a question regarding the primary control and the mechanism of the torso. So can you give us a quick review of what you talked about last time and then what you want to talk about in this one?
Yes. So last time we've seen that Alexander was talking about coordination. And very often this is not understood by most people. Reasoned coordination. I maintain that we are talking about a reasoned coordination of movements, that a series of movements, Alexander called them acts to make things a bit more difficult for us. They are preliminary acts, and these acts tend to, in fact, create a posture or a certain attitude in movement. And I maintained last time that this attitude in movement is mainly an attitude of the torso. I said that the primary control of the use of the reasoned use of the person that is learning coordinated gesture. Well, the person is learning how to coordinate different movements to produce some gestures. And I say that I maintain that, in fact, just by observing visually the mechanism of the torso of the person, it was possible to have a good idea whether the person was working in the correct direction or not. So, hearing this, many modern Alexander teachers that in fact are somatic teachers using touch, because they believe that only touch can give them an idea of the different movements or the different tensions that are occurring in the anatomical structure of the person, can give them the idea whether they are working in the correct direction or not. And so it's very good to have two strong views that are completely different. I do not teach with the hands anymore, and so my point of view is obviously totally different. So the question was, where did I imagine that watching or, observing visually the mechanism of the torso of the person would be like a control? If you want to call it primary control, you can, or a control of the work of the person learning to coordinate movements. And I wanted to answer that question before going on, because I think it's interesting, and also because the excerpt I'm going to quote now is very important to have in mind to understand my philosophy of work. Okay, so for that, I have to, in fact, go back to the books. So Alexander wrote in his first book, and it's present in the first edition of the book, so it's very early, it's 1910. And this sentence that you're going to see is very interesting on many counts. So first, let's see what the sentence is saying. When the instructions are carefully followed, the effect upon the whole mechanical mechanism of the person concerned is shown by the fact that when the coordinating principles brought about by this method are established, there is a constant tendency for the torso to lengthen, whereas the usual tendency, due to faulty standing position and the incorrect coordination which follow, is for the torso to shorten. That's page 193 in the 1946 edition. No, the 1918 revised edition. So this is quite important, and it's good to stop a second and look at it again. So the first thing, of course, that is said in this sentence is that, there are instructions that are given to the pupil, and the pupil must carefully follow the instructions. And in how to follow instructions, I maintain that the pupil has to understand what they mean, and it must be a reason understanding, and not an understanding that comes because the teacher, the touch teacher, has somatically transmitted the meaning of the instructions. Because otherwise that would mean that the instructions are subconscious. Their meaning is subconscious when the person understands more or less what it means because they have felt the movement, in fact, communicated to them by another person. Well, that would work if there was one movement, but imagine that there are a series of movements happening at the same time. Then receiving that combination of movement can only feel as a whole. There is no, in fact, disassociation between the movement. And I will show that our pupil has great difficulty to disassociate movements. So when something is impressed onto his torso, most of the time, he will not be able to really, in fact, ground the meaning of the instruction very clearly on each movement that compose the coordination of the movements. That's the first thing. The second thing that I see in this sentence is the fact that Alexander is really saying that, when the pupil carefully follow the instructions, well, of course, this is not sufficient. He adds a condition. He says, when the coordinating principles brought about by this method are established. Well, coordinating principles are not something you feel. Otherwise, they are not principles. A principle is a higher level concept. It's even higher than rules. You know, it's a form of cause and consequence system that you must understand. Not that you must feel, but that you must understand. So for the principles of coordination to be established, Alexander must be talking to the mind, not the lower mind, but the higher level mind of reasoning. Of course, that mind works with speech. When you think that by feeling something you can obtain a higher level of control or higher level of understanding, this is exactly the opposite of what Alexander is saying. You are getting to the lower mind of feelings, but never to the reasoning mind of principles. So that is so there are two conditions. First, you have to follow instruction carefully. And I will come back to that because this is very important to understand that there is a basic problem with understanding instructions in the modern Alexander technique. And the second is that the person must understand this principle of coordination. Then we can watch. We can visually observe. And the rule that Alexander is giving, when these two conditions are satisfied, there is a constant tendency for the torso to lengthen. Just to say, I did not invent anything. It's not an idea of mine. It's all written in the books. This idea that the primary control of the effectiveness of the coordination of the reason, voluntary, deliberate coordination of the movements of the different parts is seen by the constant tendency of the torso to lengthen. It's not sufficient, for example, to see the pupil just sitting quietly with the torso to lengthen. You must ask the pupil to incline the torso to create a gesture, dynamic gesture. And that is what is the constant. If when the pupil is leaning or inclining the torso forward or back, or forward and back if you want, and the torso is constantly lengthening, you have here the proof that the pupil is improving the coordination of the different movements of the parts of the torso. The last part of the sentence is talking about the usual tendency. The usual tendency is associated with the tendency to, in fact, direct these movements of the different parts of the torso according to the feeling sense, according to the subconscious guidance, or according, if you want nowadays, if you want to sound better, you would say according to somatic cognition. So Alexander is clearly saying that when you follow somatic cognition, when your movements are guided by somatic cognition, by your feelings of what is light, what is right, what you felt before, either by yourself or under the hands of a fantastic somatic teacher, he says that this will end up in the tendency for the torso to shorten. And as you will see, there is a problem here. There is also a problem of meaning in this sentence, because who knows what do we mean by the torso to lengthen and the torso to shorten? So the question that my colleague has asked is absolutely logical. It's he said, how come that you understand lengthening differently than I do? And it's absolutely obvious, or it's true, that I understand this sentence, lengthening the torso, shortening the torso, in a different way from my colleague. And so this is too important to pass. And before going on, it's very important to explain how, using a flat image, because when I give lessons abroad, a long distance lesson, if you want, I don't have the stereoscopic vision that you get when you're in the same room with somebody. I look at somebody on a flat plane, on a flat screen. The person is filmed by camera exactly as I'm filmed for the moment. And the question is, what can you observe? You have a very distorted vision of the person. Distorted may be right. I would say diagrammatic, better. Yes, in diagrammatic reasoning, it's absolutely obvious that we are not representing every single characteristic of a system or a mechanism. We, in fact, start to, in fact, eliminate some characteristic. Well, color, for example, does not tell us much. Either things like you would perceive with your eyes, which are thrown on the face, or things like that. I'm not interested. I'm interested to, in fact, see whether the torso is going to lengthen after the person has coordinated a series of movements according to a series of coordinated verbal instructions. So the process of experiment from the start neglects some aspects. What is the person going to feel when she's going to perform this experiment is not very interesting, so neglected again. And we want to, in fact, focus on what is lengthening and shortening the stature. And we are going to see that lengthening and shortening the stature has something to do with this other question, which is what is the head to go forward and up relatively to? That's the big question that I'm also going to answer here. I'm certainly going to repeat what I've said before, but sometimes these repetitions are necessary because the subject has been worked in the same way with the same perspective so many times that when a new voice appears, it's necessary to repeat oneself. This is normal. This is normal and necessary. So the tendency to shorten, I can see it using 2D pictures very easily. Especially, you will see that many pictures that I present, so there were 4 pictures presented here, 2 that you know already, 2 that you don't, and I will take other example. I'm not blaming anything or anyone. I am just stating what I see. And when I see the torso shortening, I will say it's shortening. I know that there is a person there with feelings, with a job that has done, or, well, try to do the best. I do not consider this is the best, but I know that the person has done our best. Yes, so there is just a very technical approach and thinking: is that a lengthening or is that a shortening? Is the head forward and up relatively to the torso or not? You will see. It's quite simple. So last time, in the last episode, I reminded you of this quote that has been brought to us by Alexander's Alexander's secretary that became a teacher of the Alexander technique after him. It's called Irene Tasker, and she said in coming forward, so the person, Alexander is talking of a person that is sitting, and the person has to come forward, which we would say today lean forward or incline the body forward. Inclining the body forward, never let the torso overrun the head in coming forward. Never let the head overrun the body in going backward. Yes, and so we are going to see how we can define lengthening the torso, and at the same time what we mean by having the head forward and up relatively to the torso. In fact, to start with, when I had to answer this question to myself, when I was a young modern Alexander technique teacher, I found that it was useful to have a criterion because we are asking ourselves, what did Alexander mean by having the torso to lengthen? What did he mean by having the torso to shorten? So obviously, he's describing very often what it is not to have the torso to lengthen. When you have the torso to lengthen, you will discover that he finds that the upper torso, or he says the upper chest, is much further back. He does not say further back relatively to what, but you can imagine it's further back relatively to the middle torso. So the shoulder blades are protruding. Obviously, when that happens, we have a certain consequences. For example, he's always talking about the abdomen protruding or the lower chest protruding, the maternally apparence, the expanding abdomen. That are all negative mechanical comments. There is also the lumbar curve that is in fact too deep. So this is shortening the spine. And as you well know, the spine is part of the torso. So when you shorten the spine, we accept that the idea that we shorten the torso. So that is a negative definition. But you cannot go just by a negative definition. It's too imprecise. So it's necessary to, in fact, do the job, the work that Alexander didn't do in his books, which is to describe what is lengthening the torso. This is missing. In the books, you will not find the definition, an accurate, you would say, anatomical, geometrical definition of lengthening the torso. It is strange, but it's a fact. And this fact has engendered a very complicated situation. So how to solve that problem? That sort of mystery, what is lengthening the torso? Well, I found that one thing first was to observe, simply observe what Alexander is presenting. And when Alexander is working with someone, it's accepted that he's not trying to shorten the torso. As he said, that the correct coordination of the movements of the mechanism of the torso can be, in fact, defined by the correct lengthening of the torso. So I started with this idea that Alexander tries to lengthen the torso when he works with his hands. How does he do it? So we have 2 lessons. Of course, I've got to watch these lessons and take them as a benchmark. what is lengthening the torso. So let's have a look at this. So there is having a look at it, and then you will see I have added lines because looking is not sufficient. You have, when you reason geometrically or diagrammatically, you have to, in fact, describe with speech what it is you see. You have to establish relationships. But these relationships are not something you feel. You don't feel anything when you watch a picture, a 2D picture. I hope so. It's just a 2D picture and I'm looking at it. So I have drawn something. You will see a strange yellow line on the front of the torso. I'm going to explain in a second what this means. And at the back, I have the line of the lower back. And I have a strange, what Alexander and some of his friends called the hump. It's in fact a curve that is starting below the armpit, and that curve in fact projects the head. And when we see that head projected, it's projected so that the whole face is forward of the frontal plane of the torso. When you see a plane from the side, you see a line. So the yellow line is what I call the frontal plane of the torso. That's so I assume here that Alexander is lengthening the torso of that pupil. And the two pictures that are next are pictures where Alexander is, in fact, inclining the torso of the person backward so that the person is leaning back. It's the start of many, many procedures Alexander was found of having the pupil work with. And it's a quite interesting procedures because as you can see, Alexander is only using his right hand on the very top of the torso, and the left one is on top of the head. It's quite interesting to see what Alexander is doing. And my explanation is that he's making sure that the head is not overrunning the torso in the body, if you want, on the torso, in going backward. That's what he's doing, he's going backward. And as you can see, he's keeping relatively the same relationship between the upper torso and the middle torso. I will explain. I wanted to reproduce that, that way of organizing the torso relatively to the head. Because I had found suddenly, it was the first time I found a description of what could mean the head forward and up. And it means head forward and up relatively to all the frontal parts of the torso. There is not one part of the torso that is further forward than the head that is in front of the ear. Yes, it corresponds to a description by Delsart. So for me, suddenly I had, for the first time, a real, diagrammatic definition of what could mean lengthening the torso. When you lengthen the torso, all the frontal parts of the torso are somehow on the same plane. I will show you later some picture where it's not the case, where, for example, very often the upper torso is further back than the middle torso. And you will see that in every single case, then the head is not forward of the torso parts. One torso part is always forward of the head. And you will find that in this condition, when the upper torso is not coordinated, when the upper torso movement is not coordinated properly, then you will find all the defects Alexander was talking about. So now this is a definition, a diagrammatic definition. And so when I look at a pupil, or when I look at any couple, a teacher and a pupil working together, I will look both at the pupil and the teacher. and I will try and see whether they have an idea of the organization of the mechanism of the torso that can be lengthened. So this is a diagrammatic definition. There is another definition that is also quite interesting for you to know. It's the geometric definition. The geometric definition has one advantage, is that it doesn't lie. It cannot lie. I will explain. So let's have a look. It's a very simple experiment to make. So you have for example, you can do that in sitting or standing. At first, I recommend to do it in sitting. It's easier because when you're standing, the legs are playing a big part in the position of the lower torso, and it's much more difficult to establish the lengthening of the torso in standing than in sitting. So first, we ask the person to sit, very simply, and we take 3 rulers of exactly the same length. And we are going to use a vertical plane of reference. For example, a door. We imagine that the door is a plane, of course, a 2D surface. Plane is a 2D surface. It's directed along the field of gravity. And very simply, we just ask the person to organize the movement of 3 parts of the torso: the upper part of the torso, the middle part of the torso, and the lower part of the torso, designed with in mind a particular anatomical landmark on the bony structure. These movements that we coordinate are movements of bones. Before you start a movement with a bone, and at the end of that movement with the bone has not changed shape. It has just changed position in space. This is really important and makes the difference, because we cannot, in fact, really consider the movements of the soft tissues. For example, coordinating muscle is beyond our grasp, just because muscle change shape as they move. So with bones do not change shape, they change position. So you can see that the gentleman here has organized the movements of different parts of the torso, so that in the end, the resulting posture is that all the parts are in fact at the same distance from the wall. And when this is happening, curiously, you can see that the position of the head is very clearly forward relatively to all the parts of the torso. It's impossible to get the head back if you, at the same time, want to organize the movement, to coordinate the different movements of the parts. On top, when you coordinate these movements with this end in mind, you find suddenly that the shape of the torso is really peculiar. You have the thoracolumbar spine is really flat. And then above the armpit, you get a hump. Well, of course, it's obvious the first thoracic rib that is connected to the first thoracic vertebrae is much shorter in dimension, is in diameter, than the one that are in the center of the torso. So if you want to connect the top of the torso at the same distance of the wall than the middle of the ribs, well, you have to be very much further forward with the upper torso. And when the upper thoracic spine is forward, and we will see later upward, so for the moment, let's accept it's forward. Well, it's forward by a great margin. It's the margin that is in color here. When it's forward, there are consequences. The spine in the neck is projected also forward and upward. So it's impossible or very, very difficult to get the 3 spots of the torso lengthening, well, on the same plane, and at the same time have the head very far back. It doesn't make any sense, yes? So if you let the cervical spine alone, you will find that sort of gesture, where the thoracic spine and the cervical spine are projected forward so that the head can rest nicely forward and upward relatively to all the parts, the frontal parts of the torso. So that is of interest. It seems that it is possible organizing the movement of the different parts without touching of the neck or head. It's possible to obtain this shape. And if you look closely, you will find that this shape is exactly similar to the shape Alexander was in fact asking or directing the pupil to observe, to perform. So suddenly everything started to make sense to me. I said to myself, well, that is it. Lengthening the torso is a problem of coordination of movements. If you do coordinate the parts of the torso, the head will be forward and up, and the neck will be free as a result, because there are no muscles that are inside the neck itself. The muscles are all connecting the head with the torso. So when you have such a definition, it's a diagrammatic definition now and geometric definition. Well, you start to be able to look at pictures. You start to be able to decipher whether a person is using a technique that is reason, or whether the person is using a technique that is somatic. Is the person using a technique that, in fact, implies a coordinations of movements that have to be guided with speech? Or is the person using an impression of what it is to, in fact, organize the torso or organize the movements? So the question that came and that prompted me to go back to this problem is a question of one teacher. It was not asked to me, this one, it's another one. And the question was a very generic question. The question was whether in asking the person to think head forward and up, we are in fact promoting the head forward syndrome. So it's quite an interesting question in itself, and you will see how in the initial Alexander technique, I will solve this kind of problem that does not exist for us. You will see why. So for that, it's best to see what we are talking about. And so on this image, of course, you have a description of the ideal posture for somatic persons, and you know, sportsmen very often, kinesiologists, they all have, they share the same idea that the ideal posture is with the head retracted. Well, if we compare with what Alexander was asking his pupils, it's obvious on this image to me, because the sternum is inclined backward at the top on this image and stays inclined backward at the top here. It's obvious that the person doesn't know what is lengthening the torso as a coordinated act. Yes, and so for me, that head is retracted. What they call ideal posture for me is shortening. Okay, it's shortening. But there seems to be a solution to that wrong posture that is called ideal posture here, and that we are asking people to, in fact, direct a movement of the head forward. Well, the first thing to say is that Alexander never said that anybody should put the head forward and upward. It's obviously, and it's written in many different parts of his books, it's obviously a definite instruction of inhibition. You should not, if there is any tension in the neck, it's due to the mechanism of the torso. If the head is wrongly placed, it's due to the faulty coordination of the mechanism of the torso. And it's quite easy to prove, in fact. When thinking that letting the head be go forward and up could be an incitation, an encouragement to the forward syndrome, the forward head posture syndrome, you have to understand that of course, if the person understands that the head forward is a sort of movement that will happen of the head relatively to the torso, that's correct. This is an encouragement. If the person thinks in this way, the person has no idea of the principle of coordinations, and the person will effectively, by thinking head forward and up, will effectively, in fact, endanger herself and create the cramping of the chronic forward head posture. Why? Well, because it's very simple. The head and the neck are the same group. And if you move the head forward relatively to the neck, well, first of all, this will not change the coordination of the mechanism of the torso. It will tend to make it worse. But also, if there is a movement relatively to the mechanism of the torso, the head going forward is going to pull the neck forward and down. It's impossible to think it any other way. It's impossible to distend the vertebrae of the neck, of the cervical column. The cervical column is compact. If you try really to have the head forward and up relatively to the torso, you're going to have the head go forward and down. So it's impossible even to imagine that having the head go forward and up would be a good thing. There is another way to look at it, though. It's the way of the mechanism, the organization or the coordination of the movements of the mechanism of the torso. It's possible to think that without moving the head or neck at all. And so that is, it's easy to make an experiment, a control experiment, and it's easy to show that without the head or neck to move, it's possible to readjust the movements of the different parts of the torso so that we get the torso further back than the front of the head, exactly as in Alexander's pictures. In that sense, you've got an indirect result, which is that the head is forward and up relatively to the mechanism of the torso. At no point in time in the experiment, the head or the neck have moved. It's just a question of organization, a coordination of the movement of the parts. So last time I say the pupil requires certain definite instructions. Why is it that Alexander never gave the definite instructions? Because the instructions that we get here are just neck free, head forward, and back to lengthen and widen, which are inhibition, which are something not to do, something to refuse to do, something even we don't want to see appear directly. It has to be an indirect result of a coordination. But Alexander never gave the correct instruction, or if you dig in all his correspondence letter books, you will find here and there, well, hints at what they could be, what they were. Exactly like when I said that in leaning backward, the head should never overrun the body. Or in leaning forward, the body should never overrun the head. I translate this by saying the body are the different parts, the frontal parts of the torso, and never overrunning the body. Let's have a look at a few pictures. It's quite easy to observe. You will find, well, there are two subjects here leaning forward. There is one person leaning forward in sitting, one person leaning forward in standing. And I have drawn where is the frontal part of the torso. With the gentleman, it's quite easy because he's wearing a tie. So we know that the tie is just exactly on top of the sternum bone at the top, yes? And we can see what Alexander is doing with him. He's leaning forward so that any part above the armpit is necessarily forward of the mechanism of the torso. When I look at a teacher of the modern Alexander technique that has learned without instruction of definite performance, she's only been given instruction of definite inhibition, thinking that maybe the head would go forward and up relatively to the neck. That's, I think, what is happening here. We can see very clearly that the sternum is, well, fast inclined backward at the top. And as a result, well, the head has been overrun by the middle torso. It's not only that the abdomen is protruding, it's that the upper spine is really pulled back relatively to the lower spine. So to me, I have an example of lengthening the torso and the corresponding, counter example of shortening the torso. For me, this is obviously shortening the torso. When you shorten the torso, okay, you have the protruding abdomen, you have the excessive lumbar curve, you have the shoulder blade protruding backward, you have the cramping of the upper chest, and you have the cramping of the voice mechanism. The head is clearly further back and not forward of the lower part of the mechanism of the torso. Definition is simple. You may find it ludicrous, but it is obvious that there is a stark difference in the placement of the head relatively to the torso when you look at, well, the originator of the technique, the man that invented it, and the person that is following the somatic, well, modern Alexander technique. These persons are not using the same principles of coordination. It's absolutely obvious. Yes. When I look further into this, there is another idea that I want to finish with quickly, if you don't mind. It's how is Alexander defining shortening the spine? And so I've taken, there are two descriptions where he described the concept of shortening the spine. For once, we have it, and it's the same, relatively the same definition, the description. One is in man supreme tense and the second in constructive conscious control. Let's hear what he's got to say. He says, shortening the spine. So this is the title, shortening the spine. An objector might justly say that this is practically impossible. But we are dealing with the use of the spine. And one of the most common defects among human beings today is an undue curving of the spine in the use of the self, in the acts of everyday life. Yes? This, and naturally, this causes a shortening in stature. As a practical demonstration, take a piece of paper, and after placing it flat on another sheet, draw a line among the extreme end of the top piece, thereby recording the length by the penciled marks on the paper underneath. Now lift the top piece and curve it slightly and replace it with one end touching one line and without interfering with the curve. It will then be seen that the other end of the paper does not reach the other line. Alexander is clearly giving a geometrical definition of lengthening the spine. And here it is not said, but in the previous book, he was talking about the lumbar spine. And you will find that when the upper torso is so retracted that the sternum is really pulled back in space relatively to the frontal part, to the other frontal part of the torso. So the frontal parts of the torso are shown by the yellow line. If you place, for example, a flat ruler on the lower part of the front of the torso, you will find that the head is further back. Why is the head further back than the lower torso? Well, it's because the person is arching the upper torso backward. This way of using the upper part of the torso relatively to the middle and lower part of the torso is, well, understood nowadays as lengthening the spine. The person wants the head and the lower part of the torso to be nearly on the same line. And in order to obtain that, it's something that you obtain when you lie down on a table with very few books. This might explain why the teacher believes this is lengthening the spine. Yes, but in that case, this is not lengthening the spine, as the upper thoracic curve is completely flattened backward. It's a view on shortening the spine that I have. And when Alexander is talking about lengthening the spine, yes, well, his comment is as clear. Lengthening the spine now. The foregoing will serve to show that if we modify the curve in the spine, we tend to lengthen it. For instance, to go back to our illustration, if we take the curve out of the top piece of the paper and replace it, as in the first instant, it will reach both lines, showing that during the experiment, a lengthening process has been operative. Next to that text, let's observe the picture of Charles Neal. Charles Neal, one of the first teacher coming out of the Alexander Technique Training Center when Alexander was the head teacher. Well, his squatting is very, very interesting. You will see the same shape again, the flattening of the curve, modifying the curve of the spine. We tend to lengthen it. Well, that comment raised many, many questions, because when you look at Neal lengthening the spine, and I believe he is really lengthening the spine, is exactly in the same geometrical model that Alexander was using for himself and for his pupil. Is a good example of that model. We can see that all the forward parts of the mechanism of the torso has been moved to the same plane, and this gives us a thoracolumbar spine that is lengthened. But what about the curve of the thoracic spine? Well, we see that the curve of the thoracic spine has been preserved, that this person is not trying to bring the upper torso backward, and as he's not, we can see that lengthening the spine goes well with having the head forward of the frontal parts of the mechanism of the torso. This is fundamental, and you see that you don't need to have the hands touching somebody to know whether the person is directing the lengthening of the torso and the relative position of the head and cervical spine relatively to the torso. This is the answer I wanted to give. It's a bit lengthy, of course. Alexander said that the means whereby principles involve the reasoning consideration of the cause or causes of the condition present. So the causes of the condition present is that nobody has really investigated what was the meaning of lengthening the back or lengthening the torso. Nobody has compared lengthening the torso with Alexander or lengthening the torso with the teacher he trained after him. And so for us, this is just the start, because we haven't yet touched the problem of what are these instructions of coordination. And what is the principle we are talking about? The principle of coordination. What makes instructions of coordination or not? And I hope we will discuss this in our next interview. Any question?
Yes, one question, Jeando. You mentioned that you don't use hands-on and that you use the video, so you do distance learning with people. But at the same time, you're showing images of Alexander teaching with his hands. Can you explain why that isn't a contradiction?
Yes. Well, it came out of the realization that Alexander was teaching with his hands. And so it's obvious that when he was teaching with his hands, I'm showing. I just want to show you this image where he's seen working with a pupil, and he appears to, in fact, reproduce the same model all the time. But when I look at his students, the teacher he trained, when I listen to them, Well, it's very strange, but they are not teaching the same according to the same model. They are not. If you look at the shape of the teachers when they work and the shape of their pupil when they work, for me, it's very strange, but they are all seen to shorten the torso, the mechanism of the torso. Many say that it's no problem. It's if you're free in your mind, if you feel light, everything is good. I don't believe in this sort of talk. You know, the technique was a technique of readjustment. It's a technique of coordination. When you deal with a technique, either you know or you don't know how to organize certain coordinations of movement. I have tested many teachers apart from myself, of course, because I was incapable of organizing this movement at first. All the teachers that have been that are having lessons with me or have had lesson with me, they've been filmed, and it's quite clear on film that their capacity of disassociating the movement of the torso and reorganizing the coordination is next to nil. So I suddenly discovered that Alexander had a fantastic theory, but his practice, for me, was lacking. Well, you know that somebody can be a great performer. Yes, he can understand something very well, but he may choose a technique of pedagogy that is not bearing fruits or not the right ones. So yes, I had to, in fact, reason and make a choice. Was I going to follow the train because people want to be in fact touched? They want to feel the reassuring presence and the extraordinary feeling that you get from the hands. Yes, but my position was different. I wanted these people to learn the principles. I wanted to work with their minds like any teacher would. You know, Alexander in the same book says that it's not the same thing to mold a child with the hands. And 12 pages later, he's saying that he can mold people to the correct model. It's completely strange. How could he, on one side, be so clear in his theory and then contradict himself so blatantly? You know, I, for my part, I've never seen the famous effectiveness that many people say that the hands have in teaching. Oh, in making people having fantastic experience of lightness and everything, yes. But teaching and teaching coordination, no. You cannot teach coordination because coordination is based on these associations of movements. And we will come back to that where Alexander is talking about it. But when you receive an experience from a great touch teacher, the great touch teacher is giving an experience that you feel as a whole. It's the whole. Most people, when they had Alexander's hands on them, they commented afterwards that they didn't understand anything he was doing. So from understanding anything to having a perfect understanding of the principle of coordination, I see quite a gap. And because of that gap, I noticed that it was much more effective to ask a pupil, well, to grapple with this problem of when we receive instructions at first, well, we don't know how to proceed. I discovered that simply determining actions, the start of an action, the end of an action with a verbal instruction was beyond our capacity. Well, beyond our untrained capacity. We are not trained in school or in anywhere to organize actions with speech. It's very rare. So suddenly, training people to hear instruction, to decode instructions, to translate these instructions into action, to verify that the action had been correctly translated, that is, that they were subservient to the instructions, to the model that has been used prior to the experiment and the performance of the gesture. Well, that was really, appetizing. That was really what I wanted to teach. I suddenly had discovered what conscious guidance and control meant. And from the start, I had been fascinated by this concept of conscious guidance and control, but I didn't find it in my training. And when I found it, I suddenly discovered that my hunch in the long time ago, when I started to be fascinated by this idea, was a good luck, a lucky pick, because it's fantastic. Having people starting to organize the coordinations of the different parts, having people being capable of understanding what they are doing, understanding when they are going in the right direction, when they are not, seeing people improve fast with that. Well, it's a blessing. I love this job. Is that an
Amazing.
answer?
Thank you. That's brilliant. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So everyone watching the video, you'll get links to Jeando's websites underneath, and we will continue the series next time. So thanks, Jeando.
Thanks, Kevin. Bye.